everybody, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Dana Trupiana and I cover infamous gangsters in a true crime-like format. My show, Mob Times, comes out on Tuesdays most of the time. I try to get an episode out every week. Doesn't really happen every single week, but most of the time it comes out every Tuesday. So I have a really great episode for you guys today. We're going to be talking about Carlo Gambino. And once again, this has been definitely by far leagues and leagues and leagues beyond has been my most requested video. And I've always had a kind of grudge against Gambino because of Anastasia. If you watch my videos a lot, you'll know that Anastasia is definitely my favorite mobster ever. And Carlo Gambino obviously had a hand in his death, so I kind of always hated Gambino, and I never wanted to do a video of him. But I'm working on it. We're gonna just go ahead and power on through and hopefully get a really good episode out. I do want to say, because this was so heavily requested, I don't want to just kind of pack everything into one short little episode. I know that with the Angelo Leonardo video and the O.J. Simpson video, by the time I'm done with those episodes, I am so over that human being, like I never want to hear their name again a day in my life. And when I finish those series up, I'm like, I don't want to do these 5-part series anymore because I'm so sick of it by the end. But honestly, at the end of the day, multi-part episodes like these series that I do, first of all, it's a lot easier because you're doing a lot of research into one person instead of just kind of trying to get every single thing about a human being into 45-minute long thing, and then every single thing that you miss, you have people in the comments telling you you don't know anything and that you missed this, and it's a lot easier to do these series. You also have the opportunity to do what I plan to do in today's episode, which is kind of go through, I don't know how else to put it other than like mafia terms. If you're not somebody that's into the mafia or has ever really cared whatsoever about the mafia, a lot of times these content creators, they'll get on, they'll make videos, and they're going to talk about these wars, and they're going to say these words, and if it's not something that you've ever really been interested in, you're going to sit there scratching your head having absolutely no idea what anybody's talking about, and I don't like that. The reason that I structure my episodes like a true crime episode is because, first of all, I've always wanted to grab females, and I know that females hear the word mafia and 90% of them keep on walking. You would be flabbergasted to look at the difference between men and women watching my channel. It's so heavily male, and that's because women hear the word mafia and they just kind of keep on walking. They don't care. And that's why I try to structure my episodes in a true crime-like format, because women love true crime. Love it. I love it. But I don't care about serial killers. I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't care. So I kind of merged the two, and there's a few things that we're going to go over in today's episode that if you're not somebody that's ever been interested or looked into the mafia, you wouldn't know this kind of stuff, and I'm going to teach it to you today. But if you're somebody that watches my episodes a lot, I'm so sorry to tell you this. You're probably going to hear things that I've already talked about or that you've listened to me teach you guys about already. And that's perfectly fine. You can skip the episode if you want, but honestly, I think it's going to be a good episode. You're going to want to hear the little things here and there that I haven't mentioned before. And it's always great to get a refresher. So let's go ahead and just get into this episode, okay? I've also spent a lot, and I mean a lot, of hours trying to get this video recorded, but I have just been going through the thick of it for the last, I don't know, 12 hours. It's been rough, but we're here. I'm stuffy. I'm not feeling the greatest, but I really want to get this video recorded so that I can start to record the other ones and hopefully get a little bit ahead of schedule so I don't have to take as big of a break in between the end of this series and the beginning of the next one. When somebody requested again that I do this episode, I started to look further into it just because it had been requested so many times. Like, at this point, I'm an asshole if I don't record this. So I started looking further into him and his history and his background, and there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff about him. And as much as I thought that all of this was just going to be repeated from other gangsters that I've covered in the past, there's a lot about him that I've never really talked about here. So I'm kind of excited to get through this. Also, I want to note before we even go into this episode that it has been a really long time since we've covered any of the giants or the greats. I went back and checked, and the last time I covered an old-timey gangster was when I covered Tommy Lucchese in December of 2023. And so it's been a really long time. Since then, my follower count has gone up pretty significantly, and I cringe every time I look at older content. I have a lot of issues with audio, lighting, makeup, like older videos of mine are not so great, so I don't want to tell you guys like, oh, go check out this video or that video. I would rather just kind of go through it here. That's all to say that today we're going to be teaching Mafia for Dummies. Today's episode is going to be number 1 in the Gambino series, and I'm going to be focusing pretty heavily on the history of the Castellammarese War, the Mafia Camorra War, and how the commission got set up. Now, if you're a longtime subscriber, you have 100% heard me go through this. So if you've been around for a really long time, I'm really sorry. I apologize that you're going to hear me talk about stuff that you've definitely heard me talk about before, but it's a refresher course. We can all use refresher courses every once in a while. And yet again, I state, every video that I make has chapters. So if I'm going over, let's say, the Castellammarese War, and you're like, ugh, Dana, I've heard this so many times. I can't listen to it anymore. I've listened to you talk about this too many times. Go ahead and skip to the next chapter. And then you could just keep hanging out. And I apologize that I am incredibly stuffy. My life is hell, okay? I don't know what to tell you. So let's go ahead and get started with Mr. Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24th, 1902 in Palermo, Sicily. Now, Palermo is located in northern Sicily, but to get a little more particular, it looks like he's from Caccamo, and that's a town in Palermo. I could be wrong about that. I know he's from Palermo. I did see this town's name, but it's the only time I ever saw that town mentioned, so it's entirely possible that that's not the case. Don't quote me on that, but he's definitely from Palermo. Now, for some reason, there's two things that a lot of people debate about Carlo Gambino. And the first is where he's from. I see Palermo a lot, and I also see Caccamo a lot. And I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. I know, I tried. But yeah, so people can't figure out if he's from Palermo or Caccamo. Either way, I mean, they're pretty close to each other. Caccamo is a town in Palermo, so I don't think it really matters. It's like saying you're from Brooklyn if you say that you're from New York City, I think. I mean, again, could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. The other hotly debated topic about Gambino is his exact date of birth. It's listed just as many times that he was born on September 1st as it is on August 24th, but September 1st is wrong. He was born on August 24th. I would say that maybe that could be right. I can't know anything for sure. The fuck do I know? But I have seen documents that he's actually signed himself. I'll put a picture of it right here. So I'm going to believe Gambino himself with his actual physical signature more than I'm going to believe any news article or book or whatever. It was August 24th that he was born. Now, Carlo Gambino comes from the same area in Sicily as a lot of other big names that we've talked about on this channel before. Joseph Bonanno and Salvatore Maranzano hail from Castellamare del Golfo, which is really close to Palermo. Maybe a 20-minute drive. You can see that Palermo is here, Castellamare del Golfo is right here. Very close to each other, straight shot, no issues. And that's not really surprising. Honestly, at the time, probably most of the powerful mafiosi that you heard about were Sicilian. I mean, technically, the mafia that we have now is the Sicilian mafia. So while Italy is this big boot, Sicily is this tiny little area in Italy, and that's where a huge percentage of the really powerful mafiosi are going to come from because they trust each other. And we'll go over that with the Mafia Camorra War in a few minutes, but that's why you're going to see a lot of these guys that are from this country that's huge, and they're all from this tiny little blip on this little island right off of it, and that's because they're Sicilian. I've already gone through a lot of Carlo Gambino's family history because I've already done a video on a cousin of Gambino's, Paul Castellano. Gambino's parents were Felicia Castellana and Tommaso Gambino, and each of them come from powerhouse families in the Mafia, or the Honored Society, as it's known in Sicily. Now, on each side of the family, you've got some of the most powerful men that come from the Mafia in Sicily, legit, like, they're the town senators, like, high up in the Mafia. Now, as I said, it's referred to as the Honored Society in Sicily, and it's kind of like a little more complicated version of the Black Hand in America at the same time. And often the American Mafia and the Honor Society would kind of be confused for each other, because the Black Hand is, I guess, technically the Mafia back then. It's a little weird. We'll go through it. Now, the Black Hand, much like the pre-1920s Mafia, was really disorganized. It was kind of a weird, warped version of the European Mafia, but once Mussolini came in, he chased a lot of the Mafia out of Italy, and that's why we started to see a lot of it come over to America. So before we move forward here, I do want to stop real quick and talk about this for a second, because as I said in the beginning, we're teaching Mafia for Dummies for our new viewers who may not know exactly what the Black Hand is, or the history of the Mafia as a whole. Because if you're someone that hasn't really cared too much about the Mafia or done a lot of research into it, I'm sure you just assume that the Mafia started when Luciano created the Five Families, but that is not the case. The Mafia has been around probably as long as time itself. So let's do a quick little history lesson, and again, remember, chapters. If you're someone who's done a lot of research on the Mafia yourself, or you know all of this stuff because you've been watching for a while, definitely feel free to go ahead, skip to the next chapter. But I think that this stuff is really interesting, and it's absolutely essential to know the history here and the role that Carlo Gambino played in it. So I'm going to go through it real quick. So first of all, everything that I'm about to talk about right now happened before the Five Families were created. Gambino would be a part of creating the Five Families, but he wasn't one of the original bosses when the Five Families were first created. He was a young Turk, and we'll go through that a little later. That's involved in the Castellammarese War, but right now, let's go through what the Black Hand is. So now, before the Mafia was put together strategically like a business and like we know it now, the Mafia existed in Italy, and it was kind of like a government. They enforced rules and laws, and they doled out punishment for not only people in the Mafia, but for regular citizens in the area as well. Sicily had a very rough past, and they were always viewed as kind of like less than the rest of Italy. They're considered like the redheaded stepchild, like the poor, forgotten attachment to the country, and they never really had much of a government in place back then. So the Mafia stepped in and they created that. They provided a government and an avenue to make sure that society didn't just go wild. I'm sure they're also collecting payments from everybody the way that the government collects tax, but we're also making sure that laws are followed. We're making sure anarchy doesn't take over the streets, that the regular people and the regular citizens, they're not being mistreated, and that everything is gonna run smoothly. So sometimes you gotta pay a tax, man. I don't know. So now let's move over to America. When Italian citizens started coming over to America en masse, there was areas of New York that were legit just Italian. You go through the census records from that time, and every single person that lives in that area is an Italian immigrant. So obviously, since you're surrounded by people from Italy, you're going to have some of the culture from Italy carry over to America, even though you're in a different country with different values and different beliefs and a different culture. So because such a heavy population from Italy came over to America, the Mafia would obviously carry over as well. And it started up around here. Now, if you're interested in the history of the Mafia here in America before the Castellammarese War, which is kind of what shaped the Mafia in America into what we know now, I did an episode on Giosu Gallucci, and I go through that whole thing pretty hardcore in that episode. Again, as I said before, my recording quality, my audio, everything is not what it is now, and it's really not that great now, but it was a lot worse back then. So forgive the recording quality, but there's a lot of history in that one, and there's also a lot of history in the episode that I did about Joseph Bonanno as well. So anyways, now we're over in America, and we've got the Mafia. Now, there's a few different ways that the Mafia crops up over here. You've got groups like the Gallucci gang, and they're kind of known as the Mafia, and they go into the Mafia Camorra War. And then on top of them, you've got the individual gangs, and you've got gangs like the Black Hand, and that's also considered the Mafia, so it's a little disorganized. One thing that I do want to share, because actually something I never knew, was about how the public felt about the Black Hand. Because up until now, I've always been under the impression that, like, historically, there was a huge shift in the public perception of the Mafia when one particular thing happened. I was always under the impression that the public hated the Mafia. And then one thing changed, and turned the entire public's perception on the Mafia into what it is now. A sort of, like, infamous, notorious, dark hero fascination. And what was that one thing that happened? The Godfather. The movie The Godfather came out, and as soon as that happened, as I had always thought, it caused a huge shift in the public perception of the Mafia. Because, I mean, okay, so, like, to this day, Italians hate the Mafia. And that's actually really understandable. Why is that? Because the Mafia over in Italy is not what it is here. In America, the Mafia is not really hated the way it is in Italy. And that's because the Mafia in America, they very rarely go after people that aren't in the Mafia. It's really, really rare to hear about the Mafia in America messing with a regular civilian. They also have pretty strict rules about how they don't mess with people's families. And a lot of the times, you'll even see Mafia bosses that will kill someone and then take care of their family for the rest of their lives. You don't hear about Mafia wives or children really being messed with too often. Has it happened? Absolutely. Is it a regular thing? No. With those kind of morals, it allows the public to not really hate the people that are in the Mafia or have a lot of animosity towards the Mafia itself. But in Italy, they don't have those morals. When I did the video about Luciano Leggio, it really opened my eyes to the kind of shit that goes on over there with the Mafia. It is totally a different ballgame than what we have here in America. You know how in The Godfather, the mob boss in Italy goes to kill the young child because he was the son of a rival mob boss that he had already killed? That is some real shit. That really happens. Like, 5-year-old little kids over there are getting killed. If I'm a mob boss and I have a problem with another mob boss, I'll kill that mob boss. But then I'll also kill his wife, and I'll kill his kids, and I'll kill every single person around him so that nobody will come back later trying to get revenge for that person and kill me. There's some really brutal ass shit that they do over there, and that's the big difference between the two groups, and that has a huge impact on the way that the public feels about them. But over here in America, when The Godfather came out, as far as I was aware, it had a huge impact on how the public felt about them. They went from feeling like the Italians felt, where they just absolutely hate the Mafia, hate it as an organization, and hate everybody that's even slightly thought to be involved with it, to having an appreciation for the mob. And that's when you would see things like people lighting fireworks off when John Gotti got found not guilty, and that kind of stuff. People just really appreciating the mob and the people in the mob for what they did for the neighborhoods and just for the people that they were. Or so I thought. The more that I'm reading into this, the more I'm feeling like that might not even be true. Honestly, I kind of stumbled onto what I'm about to tell you because I was reading shit into my own family and my own family history, completely unrelated to this episode. I've gone down a rabbit hole of finding every single person in my family history. Right now I'm back to like the 1600s. I think I might have like gotten someone that was alive in the 1590s. And I have some wild mafia history, like Ignazio Lupo is a relative of mine. Crazy, crazy shit. But while I was reading up on that, I saw a lot of stuff that applied to Mafia history as well. And on reading that stuff, I really feel like the Black Hand, who existed before the Mafia that we know now, may have actually been liked by the public. I started looking into it because my own family history has a parallel with a man named Joe Patrocino, which we're not going to go over here, but it's a pretty brutal story. But yeah, when I was looking into Patrocino, I learned that when the Black Hand was around, the public actually liked them. To the point that, like, they would buy stationery that had, like, pretty little black hands on it. And it was, like, a joke. They would prank their family and friends with stories about the Black Hand. They would get postcards and send it to their neighbors and their friends nearby that had these black hands on it. It was a big joke. The public ate it up. So I think that the narrative that everybody hated the mob until the Godfather came around to save the day, I really think that that is actually wrong. So, whatever. Anyway, who is the Black Hand? The Black Hand, it was kind of like a gang. It wasn't even an organization. The Black Hand really was just a reference to the threats that this group made. This gang of sorts would send a letter. It would have a black handprint on it. And it was pretty much like a threat. Like, hey, if you don't do what the letter says, which is like pay us a percentage of your check or the revenue that your store makes or whatever. If you don't do that, the Black Hand is going to come after you. There's this story that one time Congress got a letter and it had a black handprint on it, and it was like this whole scary thing. They thought that the Black Hand was coming after Congress. It was like a huge deal. Turns out what was actually happening was that a hand soap company was trying to advertise, and they had put like their handprint in coal on it, and it wasn't a Black Hand thing. But that threat was so large because they knew who the Black Hand was. So this is a very prevalent group and a very prevalent tactic to get money out of people. And very fear-inducing. People were scared of it. But again, the fact that people were going out and buying postcards that had black hands on it, that's not something that you do for somebody that you hate. Like, they may have been scared, but they were definitely amused by it. The way that history portrays it is kind of like, oh, people felt the way about the Black Hand as like we feel now about like ISIS. And that's not the case. Because you would never see somebody going out and buying a joking postcard about ISIS. That's just not something that would happen. So it definitely was more of a way that we feel now about the Mafia. And I think maybe the writer of The Godfather may have kind of put that theory out there that like, oh, I came in and saved the day for the Mafia, but they didn't hate them. It wasn't a hated organization, and it definitely wasn't the way that the Mafia in Italy felt about them at all. So as far as Gambino himself goes, he started carrying out hits as a teenager in Sicily. He grew up in Sicily, in Palermo. And again, that is the same area that a lot of these guys grew up in. You got Salvatore Maranzano, you got Joseph Bonanno, all the big, not all, most of the big Mafia guys, they're from Sicily. It's called the Sicilian Mafia. Guys like Frank Costello, they were kind of the rare ones and very untrusted. They didn't like them. Or like our group, the guys that we know now as the Mafia, they didn't like mainland Italians. So Gambino is from Sicily. He grew up in Sicily. In 1921, at the age of 19 years old, he became a made man and was inducted into the Cosa Nostra in Sicily. And we all know that in order to become a made man, especially in Sicily, but really anywhere, especially at that time, you had to kill somebody. So we know for a fact that by the time Gambino is 19 years old, he has taken a life, which I feel like killing was a lot less serious at that time for some reason. I don't know why, but you hear about so many deaths at that time. I think the human life was a lot less cared about back then. Like, killing somebody wasn't that big of a deal. Like, not so flippant, not like not a big deal, but like not as big of a deal as it would be now. So I looked through Gambino's family tree. And me looking through his tree is kind of what prompted me to look into my own. And I hate to say it, but I think I might have more heavyweights in my family tree than he did. But I saw a few of the names on his tree as I saw on my tree. So I was like, you know what? I want to look into mine as well. How funny would that be if there was some intersection between my family and Gambino, especially since my family is from 2 towns over from him, like literally a 20-minute drive. It wouldn't be that far-fetched. No, there is no family connection to me and Gambino. There's family connection to Ignazio Lupo and a bunch of big guys, but not him. Also, funny enough, Joe DiMaggio, which is not something that you would expect. I didn't expect it, but yeah. Joe DiMaggio is like my great whatever. So in Gambino's family tree, we see all over the place that he has mafia heavyweights on both his mom and his dad's side, but I can't really find any of the names. I know he had an uncle, and his uncle was a boss in the town, and he kind of became a protege of his uncle. But I don't see any specific names. But that doesn't really mean anything. Being in the mafia back then wasn't really something that was like publicized, especially over there in Sicily. It was so mainstream. It was a very common thing to happen. It's not very surprising that he would have the most powerful mafia figures in his family and you wouldn't know anything about it. So I'm just gonna list some of the names off here. If you're interested in researching genealogy, you can go ahead and use that as a jumping off point. And I'm sure that if you did some looking into these names, you would find some serious heavyweights in the mafia. So we've got the Corallo line, the Vela line, Di Gregorio, Cavallero, Fallo, Torres, and Fenichiro. And that's on top of the Castellana name, which would later be changed to Castellano. And we know Paul Castellano is his cousin, and his mom's last name is Castellano. So that name was very big in Sicilian mafia as well. So yeah, now Carlo is in the mafia in Sicily. He becomes a made guy. He kills a few guys, does a few things, and then he makes his way over here to America. Once again, we know he killed guys because back then, in order to become a made member, you have to kill somebody. He's a made member. He killed someone. Period. In 1921, Gambino hid away on a freight ship called the SS Vincenzo and arrived in Florida in America on December 23rd, 1921. He hid away on the SS Vincenzo because he killed people. I'm sure that there was something that he was running away from in Italy. I can't find anything that says that he was running away from a murder conviction, but a lot of the guys that came over to America, they did it because they were running for something. And it was a lot easier to immigrate back then, so if he came over here illegally, there was a reason. He was 19 years old. So the fact that he was unable to try to come here legally at 19, this boy was up to some shit as a kid. He must have been very well known. So it seems like his motivation to come to America might have had something to do with his dad dying. It just happened pretty close, and I've always said, I don't believe in coincidences. There's usually a correlation. If you see two things happening around the same time, probably has something to do with one another. His dad passed away in May of 1919 when Carlo was 16 years old, and then in 1921 he's entering the US illegally. So I don't know, maybe Italy became too painful for him after his dad died, so he left. Maybe he was only sticking around Italy for his dad, and once he died he decided I'm out. Or it's even possible that he was running away from something. Maybe his dad was super powerful in the mafia, and once his dad died he wasn't able to protect him anymore. Who knows? But again, a lot of the mafia guys that came over at that time came over because they were hiding from something. They were running from something. Joseph Bonanno came to America in 1924, and he came because he was fleeing Mussolini's crackdown on the mafia in Sicily. So that's kind of around the same time too. So that's possible. Maybe he was running away from Mussolini. I'm not really sure what made him make the jump, but he did, and I can tell you right now, there's no way he would have flourished as far as he did if he had stayed in Italy, so it was definitely the right move for him to come here. On December 5th, 1926, Gambino made a weird decision. He decides that he's gonna marry Caterina Castellano. Does that name sound familiar? It should, because Caterina is his first cousin. They got married in America when Carlo was 24 years old and Kate, his new wife, was 19. And let me just say, it seems wild. That's your first cousin, bro. Like, my first cousins are my brothers and sisters. Like, way too close. But it's not that crazy. So let's talk a little bit about why this happened. Now, remember, I told you that Carlo's mother and father both come from serious, powerful, powerhouse mafia families. Well, his new wife comes from his mom's side, and her side seems to be the more powerful side. Like, figure you've got people that are like the president of the honored society on his mom's side, and you've got people that are like senator level on his dad's side. Like governors, to that level of power. Well, they're both powerful. His mom's side definitely has heavier connections. So while marrying Kate is like icky, especially nowadays, we look at it and we're like, ugh. It definitely got him a lot closer to a powerful situation in the mafia because he was marrying closer into the family. You gotta think that like in those days, people had 12 kids. Like a lot of freaking kids. A lot of kids. So, like, yeah, being a nephew is gonna give you a leg up over the next guy, but marrying the boss's daughter is still gonna get you leaps and bounds above even your own brothers. So, there is a reason. It's not just, like, icky and weird. There's a reason. And next we're gonna talk a little bit about the dark truth of Sicily in that era. The Sicilian Mafia, or whatever form it was in that day, the Black Hand, the gang, whatever, they have a deep distrust of anyone that wasn't from their small little town. If you were an Italian, they wouldn't even speak to you. Like, you wouldn't even be worth them laying eyes on you. But just being Italian wasn't enough. People that were from Palermo hated people that were from Catania. Literally hated them, wanted to kill them. You're from Catania? You're not from the town I'm from, I want you dead. You know what? We're gonna go over the Mafia Camorra War. We have to. It doesn't make sense without it. The Mafia Camorra War was a mafia war that happened before there was a mafia. And it was between two Italian criminal organizations in New York City during the 1910s. The Sicilian Mafia and the Neapolitan Camorra. The war took place between 1915 and 1917, and the outcome helped establish the mafia that we know now. It helped establish the dominance of the Sicilian Mafia in the underworld of the city, and it would later evolve into the 5 families that we know and love today. The war broke out between people that were from Sicily and people that were from the Neapolitan area of Italy, and both of them were obviously involved in organized crime, underworld shit, and they were all getting into like gambling, extortion, the whole thing, but they represented different regions of Italy. Remember, if you're an Italian and you're coming across another Italian, you could very well be enemies just because you're not from the same area in Italy. And if you're from Italy and I'm from Sicily, those are 2 different countries and I hate you for it. I am from New York and I hate people that are from upstate New York, okay? I hate those people. And if you're from Jersey, I want you dead. Like, that level of ingrained hate. And it wasn't no joke. Like, it was serious, man. They did not like them. The Camorra was led by guys like Alejandro Valero and Ralph Daniello, and they were mainly based in Brooklyn. They were heavy in like Coney Island and the Navy Street area, and they wanted to expand. They wanted to get bigger. Now, the Sicilian Mafia, they're represented by guys that we know their names nowadays. Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. And they are also trying to expand. They want to make their organization bigger, and these guys clash because they're trying to expand into the same areas. Now, remember, back then, the mafia kind of mainly operated with fellow Italians. You didn't have to be in the mafia, but you did have to be Italian. If you're not Italian, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm not going to do business with you, and I'm not going to extort you. They sold drugs to fellow Italians. They gambled with fellow Italians. They extorted fellow Italians. They only worked with fellow Italians. So it wasn't too hard to understand why Little Italy would be such an important area that both of these groups would want to move in on. Now, remember, back in those days, and really up until like the 1940s, Little Italy wasn't what you know it as today. That's not what it was back then. It was a huge section of the Bronx, and it was filled to the brim with Italian immigrants. They lived, worked, breathed, and died together, especially if they ended up staying in New York, or they went to travel to the area that the people from their part of Italy went to. If you were born in America, but you know that your family heritage is back in Italy, more than likely, where you live is determined by where in Italy your family is from. Chances are you grew up where you grew up because of your family and the region in Italy that they came from. It's actually kind of funny to go through it, because I ended up where I ended up because of that, and you probably did too. I'm not really sure where every single Italian went, but like, for instance, the people that were from the area that my family is from Dynasty. If you're from that area, you mainly went to Detroit. It just so happens that the family came into New York, and my grandmother met a man, and when her family left and they went to Detroit, she stayed in New York, and that's how I am where I am now. But everybody else, my whole family's in Detroit and St. Louis. And that was not weird. Everybody in Detroit was from Dynasty. And again, the town that my family is from is so small. Like, right now, today in 2024, there's like 11,000 residents. Very, very, very little town. So if you're only looking to stay around people that are from the area that you're in, you'll travel across the country and live in a completely different area to be surrounded by people that you trust. But yeah, if you know where your family is from in Italy, go check out where the Italian immigrants at the time tended to go, and I can all but guarantee you that that's where your parents grew up. Or there's a story of why you grew up where you grew up. Like, oh, everybody in the family went, but my relative stayed. Like, there's a reason. I'm telling you. Go check. So now, tensions between these two groups are growing, and it ends up just breaking down into a series of murders and violent clashes all over the place. Eventually, the killing of Nick Morello Terranova, which was one of the big figures in the Mafia in New York in 1916, it blew everything up. Obviously, the Camorra was behind the murder. They're at war. Somebody in the Mafia got killed. The Camorra was responsible. And it just blew out into a full-scale war. A lot of people died. A lot of arrests were had. But this war happened just because these people were from different areas in Italy. And that's what I'm talking about. You have such a small little group of people that you trust. And this war was a pivotal moment in the history of the Sicilian Mafia, because that war paved the way for the Sicilian Mafia that we know now. And that Sicilian Mafia would turn into the five families. I mean, the main person in that Sicilian Mafia was Joe the Boss Masseria. And who was under Joe the Boss Masseria? Lucky Luciano. So even outside of just looking at the tensions within the Mafia, you gotta think of the extremely limited pool of human beings that you have access to when you're from such a small town in a small area and you trust absolutely nobody that's from anywhere else. Because I've been looking into my own family history and I'm looking a lot at the books in Dynasty, I see that almost every single name that's in these books appears somewhere in my family tree. Like, if you're from Dynasty, you're probably related to me. More than likely, we have some common ancestor. It was completely normalized back in the day to marry and have kids with people that are your cousins, because you don't have that many choices. And your family already trusts that family. They knew that you grew up in a strong, good household. They don't have to worry or wonder if you're a crazy person or your family is a crazy person. You come pre-approved. So whatever, man. A little incest, you just mind your business, okay? So it's not that crazy to see. So whatever. We've gone over Gambino's little incestuous relationship and we know why it happened. So let's take a look at the family that they created together. Carlo and Kate would go on to have 4 children together. Felicia Catherine Phyllis Gambino was born on September 27th, 1927. Felicia would go on to marry a man named Thomas J. Sinatra. Now, let me get this out of the way really quick. No, there is no relation between Thomas Sinatra and Frank Sinatra. While they did probably know each other, they aren't related. Thomas Sinatra was a doctor, and he sat on the board of directors of the Italian American Anti-Defamation League, or the AIADL. Does that organization sound a little familiar to my Mafia fans? It should, because it's very closely related to another organization that we know, the Italian American Civil Rights League, or the IACRL, that was created by Joseph Colombo during his time as the boss of the Colombo family. Anyways, this AIADL, the one that Thomas Sinatra is on, it indicates to me that because he's on the board of directors of that organization, he's most likely a very, very, very heavily involved Mafia member. Other members of the board of directors of that organization included Anthony Scotto and Dr. Mario Tagliagamba, and they are both very heavy hitters in the Mafia. Frank Sinatra came to perform at a lot of events that the AIADL hosted, so the Sinatras probably brushed shoulders, but they weren't related to each other as far as I can tell. His second son, Tommaso G. Gambino, was born on August 23rd, 1929, and he would go on to be a doctor. So, you got the whole incest vibe, but it's not really rubbing off on the kids. Giuseppe Joseph Charles Gambino was born on March 28th, 1936, and the baby of the family, Emanuele Carlo Gambino, was born on March 28th, 1944. And that's the last kid that the family would have, and Carlo was 41 years old when Emanuele was born. Now, a huge reason that Gambino was able to build up his reputation and become who he would go on to become was because of his criminal dealings. He did a lot of really brutal shit, and he made the call for a lot of lives to be taken. Probably a lot more than any serial killer that you could think of. Even with these brutal crimes and all the blood on his hands, Carlo was known to be a very devoted family member. He was very good about keeping his personal life and his illicit activities completely separate from each other. And that's not really that crazy of a thing. That's actually pretty common. It's very, very normal to hear about these guys that do this. Albert Anastasia, probably the person with the highest kill count of any human being in history. Way higher than any serial killer you've ever heard of. Dude has either killed or had a hand in killing over 1,000 people. Any person you've ever heard of outside of like a government figure, okay? He's not touching like Hitler numbers, but a person that is not a government figure, not leading armies or anything like that, like he's got that. But he would bring his kids to the park, and the moms that were at the park with their kids would ask him to babysit their kids so they could go run errands. Everybody in the community trusted him. So it's not outlandish to hear that this dude that's going out and killing people and extorting people and hurting people, doing all this horrible shit, comes home and is an amazing dad and makes sure that he's having dinner with his kids and checking over their homework, and everybody loves him, and oh my god, I could never see this happening. Totally, totally normal. The Gambino family actually lived a pretty modest lifestyle. They maintained a very low profile, and that helped Carlo evade law enforcement for a really long time. He was only convicted one time in his entire life, and that's throughout one of the most successful mafia lifetimes in modern history, so he was definitely doing something right. The family lived in Brooklyn at 2230 Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn, and they had the whole top floor of that building, and that's the property that they lived at for a really long time. And this isn't a super opulent building. It's not a crazy beautiful apartment. It's nice, and having the whole top floor of an apartment is nice, but it's not like movie star quality. It's really not even like rich person quality. It's just nice. And when you're looking at his family as a whole, what's interesting is that even though Carlo would be arguably the biggest name in the entire family's history in the mafia, he isn't the first, and certainly isn't the last, of his family to be involved in the mafia and the secretive nature of the mafia. It's believed that members of his immediate and extended family were involved in organized crime before him, and there's a lot after him as well. Gambino's family, like very many others in the Palermo area and its surrounding areas, had a lot of ties to the Sicilian mafia. Now, as I said, there's really not a lot of information about his family that was in the mafia before him because there really isn't a lot of information on the mafia in Italy, honestly. If you had a family member and they were in the mafia, you're probably not going to know it unless they came to America or unless they did business in America and America wanted them. Because America always made it a very big story that somebody would be in the mafia, but it wasn't really a story in Italy. Like, unless it was someone that was doing some crazy shit, it's probably not going to be reported. And that's what happened here. Carlo has the most important people in the Sicilian mafia in his family, and I can't give you one of their names because it's just not a news story in Italy. But since he came to America and he raised his family in America, I know a lot of the family members that came after him. The biggest person in the family that he really had anything to do with was his uncle. His uncle played a really significant role in mentoring him and helping introduce him to the world of the mafia and kind of held his hand and led him through becoming who he was in the mafia, both in Sicily and in the United States. And again, I say it's not reported in Italy, so I can't even tell you this uncle's name.
I do find and disclose uncle's name in part 2.
I know the uncle existed, I know the role he played, but I have no idea who the uncle is. And the family legacy name was carried on. Sylvester Stallone was pictured with the boss of the Los Angeles family in 2016, Tommaso Gambino. Tommaso's dad was Rosario Gambino. Rosario was a distant cousin of Carlo's, but he was a member of the Gambino crime family. So the mafia tradition certainly doesn't stop or start with Carlo in either direction, past or future. Thomas Gambino, Carlo's oldest son, was deeply involved in the operations of the family. He was well known for his business acumen, and he managed the family's interests in the garment district. He played a significant role in labor racketeering, and did the same thing his dad did and had the same success. Joseph Gambino, another one of Carlo's sons, was also involved in the family's operations. He mostly worked alongside Thomas in the garment industry, but together they carried on the family name and they led the family to success. And they continued to make a shit ton of money. A lot of his family members were able to thrive in what is now the modern day mafia, and he's even had quite a few ancestral offsprings take over as bosses of some of the families that he helped create. But wait, how did he create the families? Did he help to create the mafia? He must have actually created the family in New York, or else it wouldn't be named after him, right? It's still to this day known as the Gambino crime family. And he hasn't been the boss in a very long time, so he must have helped actually create the mafia, right? But no, he had absolutely no hand in creating the actual mafia. The mafia itself existed way before Gambino was ever a thought in his daddy's eyes. The mafia dates back to the 1800s, and I'm sure it goes back way further than that, but we have recorded evidence of it in the 1800s. I have family members that I can see had a huge part in the mafia, and those dudes were back in the 1700s, way before Gambino ever came around. So no, he didn't create the mafia. He wasn't even there when it was created. You ever hear of Joe Petrosino? If you haven't, you should look into him. My family member had a pretty significant role in his story, and that was way back in 1901, and he died fighting the mafia, and Gambino wasn't even born in 1901. He was born in 1902. So that's just kind of a little bit of an example of the mafia being full swing before Gambino ever came around. But he did have a hand in creating the mafia that you know now, and that was through his role in the Castellammarese War, and we're going to go over the Castellammarese War and how it shaped the mafia that we know now. Because the Mafia Camorra War, that helped establish the Sicilian mafia as the powerful mega mafia out of the whole of Italy. But the Sicilian mafia still had to be shaped into what we know now, because even when the mafia won the Mafia Camorra War and it became evident, okay, the Sicilians are going to be the ones that are going to take this, it was still just a bunch of gangs. It was never what it is now, where it's the 5 families and there's a boss or there's an underboss and a consigliere. There was none of that. And the way that it was shaped, Gambino had a role in that. The reason that the family is still, to this day, known as the Gambino crime family is because of Joseph Valachi. We're definitely not going to have time to go through Joseph Valachi in this episode. We will go through it in the series about Carlo Gambino. Probably the second part, maybe the third, I'm not really sure. But it's because of Joseph Valachi, because Gambino just so happened to be the boss when Joseph Valachi went and testified. And when he testified, the people that were bosses at that time kind of got the forever name. But we're going to go ahead and go through the Castellammarese War, what it was, where it came from, who fought it, and the hand that our Mr. Carlo Gambino had in its outcome. Okay, so the Castellammarese War was an all-out bloodbath between two warring factions in the Sicilian Mafia, and they each wanted to take control of the Mafia in America after this wave of Italian immigrants came into the country in the early 1900s. I've talked about this a lot on my channel in my early days, so if you're someone that's watched my channel from the very beginning, I'm so sorry. You're gonna hear a lot of repetitive stuff here, but again, chapters, because we're gonna go through it all now. If you don't want to hear it again, you can go to the next chapter, but I feel like we can always use a refresher. Honestly, I did a little research on this because as much as I know what happened, I don't know everything. I can always learn more, so this is a refresher course. Okay, so the first thing we got to go over is that the Castellammarese War, on its surface, it is a war between two factions, but there's levels to this shit, okay? On the surface level, this is a war between two big, huge mafia bosses, right? On one side, you've got Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, a mafia giant that climbed the ranks through the Black Hand and is now trying to get out from under the shadow of guys like Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo and kind of do his own thing and create his own little mafia. Remember, Joe the Boss Masseria was one of the major players in the Mafia Camorra War, so he's already got a war W under his belt. And this guy is also pretty well known for one thing in particular, his ability to dodge bullets. You know in the beginning of The Godfather how the mafia member is on the street and people start shooting at him and he gets away and they find him in his apartment and he's sitting there and he has a straw hat in his hand and it was shot through and they just missed his head? That was about Joe the Boss Masseria, and that did really happen. People came at him constantly. He was shot at on so many occasions he stopped keeping track. So he's already won a war and so many people have tried to kill him and they just keep failing. So this guy's feeling pretty goddamn invincible right now. On the other side, you've got Salvatore Maranzano, a mafia mastermind coming straight from Sicily where he worked under Don Vito Ferro. Now, Salvatore Maranzano, when he was back in Castellamare del Golfo, Don Vito Ferro gave him his master plan. Ferro wanted him to come to America so that he could take control of the American Mafia in his name. Now, Ferro had come to America in 1901, and he had only stayed for about 2.5 years. But when he was here, he really liked what he saw. He would have come to America and taken control of the Mafia and done it himself, but when he was in America, shit kind of went down. The infamous barrel murder took place, and he was involved in that. Now, the police knew he was involved in that, and they couldn't pin it on him, so they got him on fraud charges. They found him guilty of counterfeiting, and they got him out of the country, so he wasn't allowed to come back into America. So he wants control of the American Mafia, but he can't come do it himself, so he takes his most trusted little steed, Salvatore Maranzano, and he sends him and says, hey, you're gonna do this and you're gonna do it in my name and I'm gonna control it through you. Maranzano comes to America with one mission. Take control of the Mafia here, dispatch that annoying little peasant Joe Masseria that's running around calling himself the boss, and run the country's Mafia the way that Don Vito Ferro wants it run. One slight little hiccup happened, though. Don Vito Ferro was arrested back in Italy almost immediately as soon as Salvatore Maranzano got here. Now, it's looking like Ferro's gonna do a significant amount of time in jail, and Maranzano gets the order to just cut and run, come back to Italy, figure this shit out there. But he's just kind of like, no, fuck that. I'm gonna stay here. I'm just gonna do things on my own. I don't need him. I'm not his talking piece. I know what he wants, so I'm just gonna stay here and do this shit my way. So he gets to America and he starts building his little mafia family, but he also starts building his legitimate business. He has a real estate company and he starts putting that together and actually sees a decent amount of success with that real estate company. And this is just, your ordinary little real estate company, nothing to see here, no nefarious actions. Don't mind the real estate agents in the office with the huge gun in his waist. That's just ignore that. This is totally normal. So now you get the point. There's two mafia giants, Joe the Boss Masseria on one side, Salvatore Maranzano on the other side. They both got two completely different ideologies and they're going at it. There's layer one of the Castellammarese War. But there's also a second underlying layer that these guys don't even know about. And that is a revolution within the mafia. See, during the Castellammarese War, the gangsters are split off into two very distinct groups. You've got the Mustache Petes and the Young Turks. The Mustache Petes, they don't know that this is what they are. They've heard themselves referred to as that, but they didn't go and make themselves a group. They didn't take that role on purpose. They don't brag about it. But it's like saying that someone's a boomer today. It was just like a derogatory, okay, boomer, okay, Mustache Pete, that kind of thing. These guys were a lot older than the younger, newer generation of mafiosi that are coming into the mafia nowadays. And these younger guys that are coming in, they have a whole different ideology and a whole different idea of the way that things should work. These young Turks were born in America, or they emigrated when they were very, very young and they were raised here in America. They grew up in these diversified streets. They were friends with the Irish kids and the Jewish kids and the Russian kids, even the Italian kids that hailed from different parts of Italy than they did. They didn't automatically hate anybody or distrust them just because they weren't from the same small little town that they were. They didn't hold the prejudices or the bigotry that these older guys held, and they hated that they were expected to behave this way. Another huge difference in the way that the Young Turks looked at things was their idea of success. The Mustache Petes, they viewed success as getting a lot of power and respect, having a lot of people under you. But the Young Turks didn't really care so much about that. They didn't care so much about gaining respect as they did gaining wealth. It was all about the money for the Young Turks. They didn't mind doing business with people that were from outside of Italy or even in different areas of Italy. It didn't matter. Yeah, they wanted their own little group of guys to do business with, but they didn't want that to be the limit of who they could do business with in general. They didn't want limits on who they could gamble with, who they could sell drugs to. They wanted to be able to extort the Irish guy. The Italian community was just a small little speck on a much larger map of America and especially New York. And the Young Turks really wanted to branch out. The Mustache Petes wanted no part of that. Joe the Boss Masseria famously hated Frank Castello just because he was from a different part of Italy. He was from Calabria. But Castello would end up being one of the most successful and highest earning mafiosi of all time. So that was just one example of this stupid bigotry that the Young Turks hated. Castello, who again was one of the most high earning people in the mafia ever, never would or could have had that happen under the Mustache Petes. These mafia giants are duking it out on the streets in all-out war to maintain this stupid little tiny bubble. And the Young Turks didn't want that. They wanted to explode that bubble and be able to branch out. So they face off on the streets of New York. This war kicks off in 1929, and it has been building up for quite a while. So let's break this down by team. On layer one, you've got Masseria versus Maranzano. On that front, in one corner, we've got Masseria, and his team is stacked. He's got guys like Lucky Luciano, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Alfred Mineo, Willie Moretti, Joe Adonis, and Frank Castello. And that's only the names that you know. There were a ton more that we're not even going to mention here. I'm not going to read off every single person, but these are the famous guys in there. And everybody that had any kind of affiliation with the mafia chose a side. So there's a lot of guys here. In the other corner, we've got Salvatore Maranzano. And Maranzano is not lacking. He's got heavyweights like Joseph Joey Bonanno, Stefano the Undertaker Magaddino, Joseph Perfacci, Joe Aiello, Tommy Lucchese, and, unsurprisingly, a fellow Sicilian mafioso, none other than our own Mr. Carlo Gambino. And again, those are just the big names, not even close to the whole deck. So while they're going to war, this underlying faction starts to round up troops from both sides. Doesn't really matter if you're on the Masseria side or you're on the Maranzano side. If you're younger, if you have more progressive views, you're getting recruited by the Young Turks. And it's all under the leadership of Lucky Luciano. He leads the charge mainly because he's so adamant to turn things around. He doesn't want to live in this Mustache Pete mafia anymore. Two of Lucky Luciano's BFFs are Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and if it were up to the Mustache Petes, he would never even look their way. That's a problem for him, because not only are they some of his closest confidants, they're some of his biggest earners. They've got balls of steel and brilliant business acumen, and he doesn't see how he could run his business without them, and he doesn't want to figure it out. So they're in. Whoever needs to go to allow that to happen is gonna go. So he starts rounding these guys up. And these guys that are shooting at each other during the day are meeting up and chilling at night. They're getting together, they're trying to figure out how to overthrow this oppressive governing body that is the Mustache Petes. And the lines start to blur on who they're fighting. Because you've got guys like Anastasia, Genovese, and Costello who are fighting on Masseria's side, and they're becoming best friends with guys like Magaddino and Gambino and Joe Aiello that are fighting on Maranzano's side. Now, one kind of middleman is Joseph Bonanno, because technically, yes, he is a Young Turk. He's young. He definitely belongs to the Young Turks, and he is a member of the Young Turks. But he also definitely subscribes more to the way that the Mustache Petes think. So he's kind of on the fringe. He's not really in the middle of it because he doesn't really want the revolution. He doesn't subscribe to this let's hang out with people of different races thing. He's good with the way that the Mustache Petes think. But he isn't ratting them out. He isn't trying to overthrow the Turks. So he's just kind of on the fringe. He's chilling. He's got his little toe in the waters of the Turks. The Mustache Petes ain't no jumps, though. They've got guys like Masseria, Giuseppe Morello, Ignazio and Giuseppe Lupo, Stephen Ferrigno, Alfred Mineo. These guys are beasts. And these guys have had all the time in the world to build up their power and their respect and their name on the streets. Eventually, though, you're going to see one critical flaw here. The Mustache Petes mostly disliked each other because, again, they only trust the people from their own little town. So while the Young Turks are willing to put aside their differences and join forces to try to revolutionize the mafia, and they're willing to put aside which side of the Castellammarese War they're fighting on, the Mustache Petes are not willing to do that. The Young Turks, they don't care. They don't care where they stand on hot topic issues. They don't care about personal beliefs. They don't care about the things that each member has done in their past. If you have progressive thoughts, you're a Young Turk, and they're banding together, and the Mustache Petes aren't going to do that. Another critical flaw is that the Mustache Petes have no idea that this is happening. They never banded together because they had no idea that the Young Turks even existed. So the stage is set. Alliances have formed and wars are being fought. And 1931 rolls around. While Masseria has arguably a lot more power on his team, he does have a problem. Again, he's a Mustache Pete and he has no idea that the Young Turks exist. He has no idea that he's fighting this war on two fronts and that his closest ally and his number two, Lucky Luciano, is heading that war against him. Luciano is fighting on a whole different playing field that Masseria doesn't even know exists. But the Turks, they're tired of being at war. They're tired of bodies dropping in the streets and being in the newspapers. It's been years that they've been at war. And the biggest thing that they're tired of is the impact on their wallet. A mafia war is not profitable. And that's why you always see these guys fight so hard to avoid mafia wars, because it is so damaging to their bottom line to be at war. They don't want to be shooting it out on the streets. They don't want their friends going down. They don't want to be getting arrested in connection to murders. That's horrible for business. That's legitimately a nightmare for them. And this has dragged on for 2 years at this point. They're done. They're over this. So they start taking a long, hard look at the two heavyweights that are battling it out. And when they take a step back and look at it, it turns out that Salvatore Maranzano does have some progressive ideas that line up with the way that the Turks think. He's a huge fan of the Roman Empire, and he has this idea to put things together in a way that pretty closely aligns with the way that the Turks want to see things put together. Yeah, he might have a lot of old school ideas. He may not want to work with people that aren't Italians, but hey, who's perfect? Maranzano wants to create a structure in the mafia that would have it looking a lot like the government of the Roman Empire, or, as the Turks saw it, a commission made up of the most important members of each of the families. New York segregated into 5 families, with one boss in each of those families, and each of those bosses having a seat at the commission. Bring in a leader from the family upstate and the family in Chicago, and you've got yourself a nice little empire, with a capo di tutti capi, or boss of bosses, sitting right at the head of the table. And Maranzano planned to take that title for himself, and that is just fine. Luciano wants no part of having that title. He has never wanted to be capo di tutti capi. As far as Luciano sees it, the title is just a big fat target symbol in the middle of your forehead. And Luciano has never had any dream of holding that title or that amount of power. Maranzano can have it. What Luciano wants is much more humble than that. The number 2 seat. He likes Maranzano's idea of 5 official families in New York and a family for each territory outside of New York. New Orleans, Detroit, Los Angeles, Florida, they can all have their own territory. But the New York guys, the organization that is the commission, were the end-all, be-all judge and jury, and they made the decisions. And Luciano really likes that idea. So after 2 years at war, in 1931, Luciano decides enough is enough, he's not doing this anymore. Him and his boys approach Maranzano, and they work out a deal. We'll take out Masseria. We'll put you in the number 1 spot as the capo di tutti capi. Since the title is oh so important to you, have it. I don't give a shit. Just shut the fuck up. You can take it. But we're going to need to come to some agreements. First off, I want to be number 2. I want my own New York family. I want a seat on the commission, and I want a say in how the rest of the families are put together. Maranzano is sick of the war himself. Everybody's sick of this war. It's been going on over 2 years. And this conversation is making him see a clear path to victory. So he agrees. He takes Luciano on as his number 2, and together they appoint the remaining 3 families a boss. Luciano takes a family, Maranzano takes a family, and they put Tommy Gagliano, Joseph Perfacci, and Frank Scalice as the bosses of the remaining families. So Salvatore Maranzano is going to take the family that was just given up by Niccolò Schiro, and that family doesn't really have much of a solid leader right now outside of Maranzano. He doesn't get a nice new shiny family to be the boss of with a bow on top like everybody else, but that's fine. Because all the light touches is his kingdom, because he is the boss of bosses. Luciano is going to take the family that Masseria is currently leading, which is perfect for him. He's already running everything anyway. Luciano is the one that's on the streets doing all the legwork. All the people are being run by his management anyway. Masseria is getting shot up every time he leaves the office. He doesn't really do much boots on the ground work anymore, so he's good to go. Once Masseria isn't around anymore, Luciano can just put the word out like, hey, instead of being number 2, I'm number 1. Come to me with your issues. No problems. Smooth sailing. Perfect. Joe Perfacci is a no-brainer. He's already been leading this family since 1928. We're just installing him as the permanent boss instead of overthrowing him like we're going to have to do with Masseria. The family that Gagliano is taking over, he is already kind of leading this family as well. He took over in 1930 when Bonaventura Joseph Pinzolo was killed in the Castellammarese War. Again, he's just being installed as the true and official boss of the family. Now, this last family, it's a little shaky. The family was being led by Alfred Mineo, but he was killed in the war, and the family didn't really have a boss. Frank Scalice is a dude that's just like ride or die on Maranzano's dick, so he gets a family. Obviously, Maranzano wants him to have his own seat on the commission and his own family because he's ride or die for Maranzano. It's pretty much like another vote for him. But don't get too attached to him because he's not going to hold this seat for very long. So the structure has been built. Everything is in place. Now all that's left to do is end this war and get everything solidified. Too easy. Masseria, he's chilling. He's good. He's winning this war. Everything is looking up for Masseria. Everything's going his way until it's not. Luciano is Masseria's number 2, and he's feeling great about this. No issues. But then he gets a whisper in his ear one day. His most trusted soldier, Lucky Luciano himself, has gone behind his back and betrayed him. Luciano has made a deal with Maranzano to take over Masseria's rackets and be Maranzano's number 2 on this absurd idea of a commission that these two idiots put together. That's okay though, because Masseria, he has a secret weapon, and his name is Joe Adonis. Masseria goes to Adonis and he's like, hey, so, listen, crazy thing. I just heard that Luciano is planning on taking me out and taking over my rackets. We are not gonna let this happen, okay? So here's the plan. You kill him and I'll give you his spot, okay? Okay, cool. Let's do that. Now again, remember, Masseria has no idea that the Young Turks exist. So he has no idea that Adonis and Luciano are actually BFFs. And that this whole group of younger gangsters has been getting together and scheming behind their back and doing bonding exercises for years. All while he waged war on the streets. Adonis gets this order to take out Luciano, and what's his first stop? He knocks on Luciano's door. He's like, oh my god, you would not believe what Masseria just said. And they're laughing together like it's super funny. So Luciano, he's like, well shit, man, like I didn't want to do it this fast, but whatever. It's a little quick. It's a little faster than I wanted this to happen, but shit happens, man. So he goes to Masseria and he's like, hey, I heard you wanted me dead. I'm not sure why. Like, I don't know what you heard, but like, you're my man. Like I ride or die for you. I will die for you. I love you. I admire you. You're everything. I'm your homie, your buddy. You know what? How about this? Let's go to lunch. We'll chill, we'll chop it up, we'll play some cards. I'll show you that I'm your boy still. You do not have anything to worry about with me. Whoever whispered in your ear, they were lying. We're biffles, okay? Let's do lunch. So they set up a lunch date for April 15th, 1931 at Nuova Villa Tamaro in Coney Island. Now, during this lunch, they're chilling, they're professing love for each other, playing cards, and Luciano is like, all right, I gotta pee. Gets up, goes to the bathroom. While he's in the bathroom, a bunch of dudes bust in the door, and finally, somebody is successful, and they take out the destructible Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. So, yay, win. Castellammarese War officially over. Salvatore Maranzano is the new head honcho, and they immediately go to work setting up these families and putting the structure in place of the commission. Maranzano throws a whole big-ass feast as like a celebration dinner / kiss the ring, I'm the new boss, bask in my awesomeness. So over the next few months, they put shit together and they start preparing for this big meeting where Maranzano can officially announce the new mafia and the new structure and tell everybody how it's gonna be, and announce Luciano as his number 2. But see, Luciano has a little bit of a problem with authority, and he starts feeling like Maranzano might just be worse than Masseria ever was. So he's gotta go now too. And Maranzano has the same exact story as Masseria. He heard whisperings that Luciano's gonna take him out, so he decides he's gonna off Luciano first. He hires somebody to take Luciano out. In another boss-ass move by the Young Turks, Luciano gets a heads up by one of his Young Turk boys that Vincent the Mad Dog Cal is coming to kill him. And the other Young Turk, Tommy Lucchese, beats Maranzano to the punch and makes sure that Luciano's gonna pull through. Luciano goes to our Mr. Carlo Gambino and he's like, hey, your boy is going freaking crazy and he's gotta go. We gotta figure this shit out. We gotta get rid of him. We're just gonna take him out and everyone from that dumbass Mustache Pete era is gonna go. I'm done. Fuck them all. Let's get rid of every single one of them. And we're just gonna build this shit from the ground up. The Young Turks is gonna be the new mafia. So Luciano and Gambino, they put their heads together and they come up with a plan to take out Maranzano. They assemble a team of Jewish gangsters that none of Maranzano's people have ever known before, and they set up a plan to take out Maranzano. Less than half a year after Maranzano took the title of Capo di Tutti Capi, on September 10th, 1931, Salvatore Maranzano was killed in his little real estate office. Now, according to myth, that night, the Young Turks put together a mass extinction level attack on the entire generation of the Mustache Petes. Now, in reality, that probably didn't happen. More than likely, people that have told these stories over the years have kind of just taken all the deaths that happened during the Castellammarese War and lumped it into this one night that was dubbed the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Now, that night, we do know that Salvatore Maranzano and a bunch of his boys were definitely killed. But the way that it was portrayed, that Maranzano was killed, and then all of a sudden, they take to the streets and they kill everyone that's older in the Mustache Pete's era, and hundreds of bodies dropped that night. That's not what happened. There were a few deaths. There was definitely more deaths that week than like your average Tuesday, don't get me wrong. But it's definitely been conflated in the century since, and it probably wasn't anything crazy. And I mean, if you look at Luciano and the way that he operates, that level of crazy was never really his style. So now there's no longer Masseria, there's no longer Maranzano, and a fellow Young Turk fringe outlier, Joseph Bonanno, is given control of the Maranzano family, and Maranzano's little butt buddy, Frank Scalice, he was kindly asked to resign from his position as boss of the family. See, I told you not to get too attached to him. In his place, Vincent, the executioner Mangano, was installed as the new boss of the family. And it's actually pretty interesting that he had that nickname, the executioner, because he would be taken out and superseded by another the executioner, Albert, the executioner Anastasia. But I digress. So now the little saga of the Castellammarese War and the entire fallout from it is officially over. We are now setting the stage for the new and improved mafia. A meeting was called, the commission was cemented in place, and the National Crime Syndicate was created to be a worldwide governing body of criminals in general. The National Crime Syndicate is to criminals what the commission is to the Italian mafia. And dudes like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Dutch Schultz, Louis Lepke Buchholter, they can all have a seat on this National Crime Syndicate where they can't have a seat on the commission. Another organization that was created during this time was called Murder Inc. And Albert Anastasia and Louis Lepke Buchholter were put in place as the leaders of this little Murder Inc. branch that carried out murders for the mafia. Okay, so now that we've gone through all the history, unfortunately, usually when I do an episode, the first episode of the series always has to go through all the history, and it can be a little tedious, but it does need to happen so that you can understand everything that's coming. Now that the history is out of the way, we can start getting into the nitty-gritty of who Gambino is and the epic empire that he's about to build. I'm sorry that this episode ran like really long. I hope you guys enjoyed this little refresher course if you already knew all of this. And if you didn't know everything, I hope you learned something. And either way, I hope you enjoyed. Come back next week so we can continue going through Gambino and the crazy shit that he does to build his name and legacy as one of the Mafia's most elite figures. Please don't forget to like, share, comment, follow, subscribe, do all the things. And I'll see you next week. Bye.